Well, welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Left Reckoning. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. I'm in sparkling HD for you, David. Good to be with you.
It is a real
Are
treat.
you in the MR studio? I was actually going to ask. You're at home. Okay, cool. Cool.
Yeah, really beautiful things happening in Matt's abode right now, but we'll talk about that later. Danny, thank you so much for joining us. Y'all know Danny Bessner. Danny Bessner is TMBS Crew Forever, co-host of American Prestige Pod, amongst many, many other things, expert in Hollywood, politics, foreign affairs. Danny, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, man. It's always really fun chatting with you, and there's a few topics that we want to hit today. But the first one I want to ask, your perspective on is Syria. That's a kind of a conflict, that has been around, as long as I've been doing kind of political journalism, political media, and I just sort of wanted to get, your take of the general, lay of the land there, and also, does it feel like history might be moving? It felt like that was a protracted conflict that might kind of last forever. And I don't want to talk too far into the future because we don't know what's going to happen yet. But anyways, I was just curious your thoughts there. Yeah.
It's a good question, and I think the way that I view it is as not an expert in the particular conflict, but it's sort of looking at the region macro historically, is I think that one era has decidedly come to an end. The sort of Cold War era, secular Arab dictatorships, while still extant in a place like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, are nonetheless shifting into something new, something that's unrelated to their structures in the Cold War. And I think that this is a reflection of that. So it's definitely entering a different era defined by novel power relationships, although I believe it's a little bit too early as to what this means. The biggest thing, of course, as it relates to the United States, is Israel's invasion. And so what is Israel planning on doing? What does this mean for Gaza? What does this mean for Lebanon? And it just seems like Israel is on the power rise in the region. It's backed 100% by the United States, and that looks to be the new reality. You might see something like a return to what was the goal of the Abraham Accords, which is essentially reaching a concordat with the regimes that had lasted out the Cold War with Israel and sort of trying to stabilize the region. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that continues to happen. I think that I don't even want to use the word antagonist because it's not quite correct, but the regimes that effectively don't want the United States in the region, like Iran, and the various Arab regimes around the Middle East, have shown themselves unable to actually direct affairs there. And so I think that kind of lends itself toward a form of U.S. brokered concordat. And I say brokered because I don't think the United States has as much of an interest in the region as it had for, let's say the 1960s onward. I do think that is a real shift in geopolitics, that the Middle East is of less relative importance to the United States, especially when compared to China. So I would see something like a U.S. brokered stability where Israel is effectively allowed to do what it wants as long as the other regimes in the region basically allow U.S. interests there to hold. That's kind of what I imagine happening, although it could be wrong and other things could happen.
I mean, I'm curious, like HTS, right? This group here in Syria. I mean, the way that the United States is responding to it, at least right now. Again, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. Feels very different from how it might have in just recent memory. I mean, is there just less worry about this form of like political Islam?
There's less interest in it. I mean, as you guys well know, what movie was Rambo 3 that was dedicated to the brave mujahideen of Afghanistan, right? So it's actually to some degree quite natural.
It's like a reset,
a rather conservative American world to get along with it. That was the argument that was made back then. It's like they're like you are, religiously conservative, and they don't want change, and they're not like these radical, socialists and New Dealers. And so that has a long history, and the fact that political Islam became of interest due to like kind of the vagaries of 9/11. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a secularist. The American enemy in the region was not political Islam. It's mostly 9/11, and that has been viewed as not such a success. So I could totally see a concordat between American elites and political Islam. That was always a tough fit to some degree, that they were the enemy. It was just so racist. That was basically the source of it. It was just like they were it was basically racialized to an incredible degree, and it was almost the war on terror was almost refracted more through a lens of race than a lens of Islam, where Islam became associated with race in a sense, even though particularly in the first years after 9/11 there was a big focus of Islam, but that goes away by the 2010s, I would say. Yeah, I could totally see getting along. Absolutely.
How close, or how do we view this time of like war generally? Because it's not just Israel and Syria and Gaza, but also Ukraine and the connection that has to say Syria, like, and then America. Joe Biden says, we're not at war in the world anywhere, but we are kind of right behind a lot of people who are. How do you view this moment? Like, are we close to like a world war scenario? Like, what's happening?
Okay, so Ukraine was always deep in Russian territory. So it was always going to be very difficult for a not extraordinarily powerful United States to exert significant control over that country, and it's almost like inevitable. Just like the United States is not going to be able to exert control over what happens in East Asia vis-a-vis Taiwan forever. Same thing happening with Ukraine. So I think it to some sense it's like that's not even a philosophy like people say that's realist. It's just obvious. It's common sense, right? Like the Mexico is of more interest to the United States than it is to China. Just like Taiwan is of more interest to China than it is to the United States. It's just fundamental obvious positions. So no, I don't think we're on the verge of a world war because I think these are regions that are ultimately peripheral to the empires that are in them. And so then you could say, well, wasn't the Balkans, which is where World War One broke out, that was also a periphery. So isn't this similar? I think the world is significantly different than the sort of intertwined alliance system of Europe that led to the outbreak of World War One and declining monarchies than it is to today. So I don't think we're on the verge of a world war. What would lead to something like that is if the United States decided to go like balls to the wall on an invasion of Taiwan. Were that to be done in the next 5-10 years. My guess is that China's going to wait to do it until it's become like common sense that the United States isn't going to do that. I don't think this is of like immediate necessary political interest to China. They could wait 25 years. So that's what I imagine will happen in terms of the capacities for world war.
But I mean, on that, particularly like, Ukraine is the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I mean, have been massive. One,
particularly
specifically,
prices.
Also just talking about, Syria, for example, too. I mean, that, effectively pulling Russia out of the region there. Obviously, the prices, Branko Marcetic, our good friend and writer, Jacobin, wrote a piece in The Nation, just about the price shock that we experienced regarding inflation being very much caused by Ukraine. So,
price shock, absolutely. That I think is the biggest.
At the same time,
cause.
like I hear the argument about like maybe these states being on the periphery, but I mean the how globalized our economy is now. It makes it hard to sort of locate places as being on the periphery or the core in a lot of ways.
For sure. I guess I would say of geopolitical interest periphery, even if it's central to the global economy, in particular supply chains. And this is the interesting thing, which is like, where does the security order overlap with the economic order and where does it not, right? And so this is like what I think U.S., a lot of American elites are trying to do vis-a-vis China, which is maintain maybe not quite as significant an economic relationship as had been at particular recent points in history, but an extremely significant economic relationship with China, while also doing, political security affairs in a different way. And so, yeah, I would agree, particularly when it came to price shocks. Ukraine was extraordinarily important to the international economy, but I don't think the U.S. is going to deploy significant military force in order to keep it in the sphere of influence. And I think that they were ready to basically hand it over to Putin in the first couple of weeks. And when Ukraine actually nobly fought off the invaders, they were like, oh, this is a way to give Russia another Afghanistan. And that essentially is what they were trying to do. That which is not, I think, of a core U.S. political interest, geopolitical interest.
Danny, I have a question for you, as somebody who I think, makes a lot of arguments from like a materials perspective. When you use a term like, geopolitical interest, right? how do you differentiate these things from, maybe like a pure economic interest to like other things? Like, for example, like, you hear Putin and he talks about Ukraine and he talks about like this grand history going back hundreds of years.
Yeah, Kiev
Iran,
versus,
when it comes to Syria, right? There's like, oh, there are important holy sites in this country. We need them to be defended, right? And these are things that are very much, argued by Iranian officials why they're engaged in Syria. So, do these, when Putin makes this or somebody in Iran makes those kind of arguments, is this just like what they sell to the public, or do we think that those other kind of factors do play a role in what becomes like a strategic or a geopolitical interest of one of those countries?
so I don't think Iran would necessarily risk a lot to save those particular religious sites. I think that it is mostly for other power regional um, power political if sort of interests more than they care necessarily about the religious sites. I think that power or what leaders perceive as necessary for their security is what drives a lot of policy. I think those perceptions could be incorrect. I think that the United States, for example, its elites perceive that global hegemony is necessary for American security, and I think that's a misconception. But I would say like that's why the United it views things as in its necessary geopolitical interests, and I don't think Americans believe that their elites believe that the security of their nation depends on controlling Ukraine. Given that the United States hasn't controlled Ukraine for most of American history, and it hasn't been necessary of critical interest. And I think that the United States got involved in the Middle East for oil, and I think that we're going to move off crude oil in the next coming generations. And so I think it's going to be just of decreasingly less interest to the United States, even if, of course, as for much of the last few decades, most of the energy from the region actually went to Europe, but sort of considered within the Western polity. So I think that we will see shifts in U.S. policy based on the political, economic perceptions of its elites, more than not.
How would you rate Obama's Syria policy in retrospect? I mean, the red line is maybe the famous moment, but I'm curious what sticks out to you.
Well, he didn't get like super deeply involved. I think that was the unique thing. If that was 2009 or 2010 or how he reacted earlier to Libya, I think things would have been different. And I do think that like within the framework of American empire, not being as involved in Syria as the U.S. was in Libya was a choice made by the Obama administration to avoid getting deeply involved in a region that was deemed by them to be of less and less interest. And I think the region is of less and less interest to America. I mean, the famous Jake Sullivan speech before October 7th was like, the Middle East is calm and great because we don't really want to care about it anymore. That's still true for the most part, in my opinion. That's what elites still mostly believe. It is a peripheral interest.
I mean, it's one that has had, I think, significant effect, particularly like on American politics. And I wanted to sort of pivot on that. Danny, like you've written some really great pieces over the past few years on, let's call it the fascism question. And I mean, if we want to, we can talk about it a little bit. I don't feel the need to like really relitigate it as much as to sort of ask you. Huge election. Some people were pretty shocked by it. How does this update change? Does anything about your kind of theorizing about Trump and Trumpism sort of shift in results after seeing the results of this election?
Well, I think the consensus is emerging, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on the right side of this, but that it wasn't fascism, because I think a lot of the argument for fascism, it had to be counter-majoritarian. And the fact that when Trump won the popular vote, I think basically says whatever's happening is appreciably different enough from one of the core features of fascism that it's not a useful analytic. So that's what I would say. I think you're going to actually hear less about it because the counter-majoritarian thing is really, really crucial to the arguments. So the fact that it was a popular vote is, I think, tough for the other side to overcome.
Well, I mean, so this is, I mean, a pretty massive shift in U.S. politics, right? This is something we've been sort of asking most of our guests here, but, what do you make about terms like dealignment or realignment even? Do you agree with either of those theses about this most recent election?
Yeah, I think the system has basically shown itself to be incapable of redistributing material wealth. And that's reasons that's true on the right, and there's reasons that's true on the left. And I think you're going to see a similar thing to what you saw in the late 19th century, which is like no party is able to maintain a governing majority, really. So you'll see shifts back and forth. It'll be interesting to see what the Republican Party has without Trump. It doesn't seem like they really have much. Because I don't think neoliberalism, I think, as even though the politics are mostly, and sorry, the political economy still remains neoliberal, it's not like a winning argument. Like Paul Ryan just retired from politics essentially. But then the answer is sort of J.D. Vance national conservatism, which also is just fantasy. You're not going to like bring back the Rust Belt. If you just look at the share of the American political economy, 8-9% are industrial workers.
Danny, not to cut you off, but you are not a big fan of the idea of like onshoring or reshoring.
I just don't think it's realistic.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's realistic in the short term. And I think in the medium term, we need to reconceive our relationship to consumption, which I think is like consumer-based capitalism is like a relatively recent phenomenon. It's really of the mid-1960s. And I do think that have been shown to be such a direct cause between consumption and climate that like we fundamentally need to reconceive that. And so like I don't think the answer is reindustrialization to like a booming mid-20th century consumer economy, because I don't think that is possible given the externalities of that level of industrial consumption. So I think like that's like it's missing like the big thing that's happening, which is that the Industrial Revolution is changing the ecosystem. And that is going to have an incredibly negative effect on humanity. And so we need to deal with like that initial problem of industrialization, which to me is of a higher order issue than bringing back. I mean, what would it cost to even add to 2% of the American workforce? 8-9% of the American workforce is industrial work. It's mostly a service economy. So how would you quadruple that? It doesn't seem possible. Plus the fact that there is America doesn't have like the literal knowledge base to reproduce a post-industrial capitalism. Like who is going to build all of these factories? Who is going to build these large networks? It just doesn't seem to me realistic.
I mean, it's one thing that we've been sort of watching, America struggle with is the capacity, even for like state-led industrial policy. Our capacity to do that has been tremendously limited. And you certainly saw that a lot under the Biden administration. You also saw it under the Trump administration too, during the COVID pandemic, right? It was like there was a need for the state to actually engage in the American economy, to maybe direct it, to maybe start producing things on their own. And there was, panic because the American state has effectively said, we're not going to get involved at that level anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and the truth of the matter is, the problem is that Marx's dream was correct, but it happened under capitalism. Like a lot of these technologies basically remove the need for the type of drudgery work that defined industrial capitalism. The problem, though, is that in a capitalist society, people are just viewed as objects in and of themselves, so they get extracted from in other negative ways. So there's no way to use the technology to actually free up human time for more creative, fulfilling pursuits, which is what Marx wanted. So, yeah, it's kind of fucked. Instead, you're just viewed as like your data is sold, and you can't get help, and you get denied healthcare. And so it's all pretty much fucked unless you're a rentier and happen to own property because you happen to be born of a certain age group.
So I mean, the picture that you're painting is pretty bleak, and I think bleak in the sense of like the American system is just kind of fucked, and some kind of tweaking around the edges is not going to. Go ahead, Matt.
On that note, David, is the failure at Intel to like, and I don't follow the chip stuff as close as I should, but I'm skeptical of the tariff stuff with China. Is failure at Intel going to save us from like conflict with China? Because if Intel was like popping off, like am I wrong to think that that'd be more likely?
Yeah, I think they're doing that whole like they're trying to make the chips in the West now, but again, like it all just avoids the fact that stuff is destroying the environment. You just can't do it forever. So I think that's going to have to be faced at some point. It
and especially redundantly on every continent, right? Like let's have a foundry.
So I don't know. Yeah, it seems like there are bigger issues to be talking about.
But we're not in a situation. I mean, like, so look, I think we can paint the picture pretty clearly that, Josh Hawley's PRO Act. I don't know if you've seen this. Josh Hawley is going to do like his own version of the PRO Act that's going to be more acceptable to Republicans, which I'm sure just is going to be about bringing back strong men and getting rid of weak men.
Work,
so I agree. That's not going anywhere. You look at the Democratic Party though, and like even at some of the more, I don't know, better ones. I have a hard time sort of seeing that those people being able to reverse the trends of class dealignment in American politics. So, I mean, is there anything that you're sort of seeing, watching, that might be able to put a kind of political breakthrough here? Or should we just be sort of making friends and having fun?
I don't see it. I mean, the elites have shown themselves remarkably unable to do like basic redistribution. Like even if you're a Democratic Party person, wouldn't you want to forgive student loans and get like a generation of upwardly mobile political managerial elites on your side? The fact that they can't do that is like, it seems like there's a cancer in the system almost that it can't even heal itself. Like the white blood cells aren't working. You're not getting the FDR. To be like, oh, hold on, things are getting too fucked. We've got to help people in a genuine way. So I just, barring even that, I don't see it. They kneecapped Bernie, and that would have been like a viable path forward to a return to sort of a Harry Truman-esque fair deal liberalism.
But Danny, do you really think ending the big banks, ending too big to fail, would have cured racism?
No. Someone should have said, and neither will your campaign. It's like, that's also not going to end racism. But yeah, it's fucked.
On that front, I mean, you're somebody who's, you're in the muck with the rest of us. You're a podcaster. You're on Twitter. It's been interesting to see. There was a brief moment when after the Trump's victory, and you saw some of the exit polling, that you thought you might start to hear maybe some different kind of arguments from the American liberal pundit class. For the most part, they can't
do it,
but they can.
And also, you look at MSNBC. I think Chapo probably gets way more listeners than MSNBC on the average.
I'm sure.
That's crazy.
I'm sure.
I would bet, I have no idea. Double, triple, sometimes quadruple the numbers, I would imagine.
Sam Hasselby, I believe, put numbers that said 38,000 a night. Majority Report does more than that. Chapo definitely does probably 5 times that. I mean, they're not a nightly thing, but it's still, that's crazy.
That is crazy. It's crazy.
I mean, but again, it's like, so this rot that we're talking about, it goes not only through the political class, but it's also through the pundit class and a lot of aspects of American society. And you're a historian of elites. Is it, do these guys just all grow up too soft? Are the incentive structures in American society too rigid? I mean, really there is just a rot in so many aspects of our life now.
There really is. I think the end of the Cold War was really bad because I think it removed guardrails on a lot of things, and the total deregulation of the economy was not a good thing. And I think that people associated, obviously they had to sleep at night, so they associated what they were doing with something virtuous, and they convinced themselves of that, and they were just totally unable to incorporate a critique. I also think that as capitalism finds fewer and fewer places to go, it has to get more and more paranoid in a sense. There's just fewer places to invest, and you have to be really rigid in your defense of the system. But yeah, it does seem, it's a very kind of hopeless moment. I think it sucks. It would have been really fun to be alive in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s. Yeah, of course, but to be on the left and have a communist party,
Oh, I mean, dude,
that was meaningful in politics.
I don't know if you've ever read any stuff I've done about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in the South, but absolutely incredible. Not only the things real kind of storybook moments, taking on the KKK and stuff like that, but also just having the most insane adventures and parties and middle of nowhere Oklahoma and stuff. And I just don't think that that's happening with
it's just
our good friends in the DSA as much as I would hope that it was going on like that.
Yeah. No, it's a whole cultural political world that doesn't exist anymore. That's unfortunate.
Well, Danny, thank you so much for hanging out with us today on Left Reckoning. I mean, obviously, people should be subscribed to American Prestige Pod, as I've told you and your co-host. No, I've been having troubles figuring out how to deal with my membership, and I now have 3 memberships to American Prestige
Good.
Podcast.
That's
So
exactly. Just keep on. Don't. There's what's to deal with. Get
Did
3
you follow
more.
the email? Because I gotta say, like, I was in the same boat, and then I figured it out, and it was actually pretty easy.
No, I mean, it's because we have our show
Right,
account.
right.
I have like 3 different emails, so I just can't figure out which
Yeah,
one's which.
it's always annoying to move platforms, but I think this will be the final move.
But I mean,
I don't think
you
we
know,
could do another.
They do more than just scam you out of your money. They have a really great podcast.
In addition to scamming you out of your money.
No, I really do. It's a must listen for me every week. I highly suggest it to all of our listeners if you haven't been listening before. Is there anything else that you got coming up that people should be on the lookout for?
No, just check out American Prestige, and I'll have some publications. I have a review of Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson's latest book coming out in the Nation. I'll mention it on the podcast, I'm sure, and post it on Twitter.
Yeah, brother. Well, we always appreciate talking with you. Hope to do this again soon.
Thanks
Yep,
for
thanks,
having me. Bye.